Picture this. It is 4:47 in the morning, Taipei time. A Taiwanese Coast Guard radar operator stares at his screen and sees something that makes his blood run cold. Not one blip, not two. A wall of them. Dozens of contacts, military-grade transponders. PLA Navy surface ships, planned submarines running shallow, and above them, J-20 stealth fighters cutting through the pre-dawn sky in formation, crossing what has for decades been an invisible but sacred line. The median line of the Taiwan Strait, gone, crossed, erased in a single night. Within 18 minutes of that radar contact, an emergency call goes from Taipei to Washington. Within 32 minutes, two U.S. carrier strike groups, the USS Ronald Reagan and the USS Theodore Roosevelt, receive new operational orders. This is not a drill. This is not a simulation. This is what happened in the last 72 hours. And what you are about to understand is not just a military flashpoint. It is the opening move of a confrontation that could determine whether the world order built after World War II survives the next decade or shatters inside the next 72 hours. Stay with us, because this one has layers that most people have not even begun to understand. Welcome to World Brief Daily. We break down the most consequential global developments with the depth and clarity they deserve. If you are new here, subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because in a situation this fast-moving, every hour counts, and you do not want to be behind. Let us start with what actually happened, because the details matter enormously here, and the mainstream headlines are only giving you the surface layer. On Tuesday, the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, officially launched what Chinese state media is calling Joint Sword 2025A. That name is not accidental. Joint Sword 2024A was the exercise Beijing launched in response to a high-profile visit to Taiwan by foreign officials. This is the sequel, and it is bigger. According to confirmed tracking data from multiple open-source intelligence platforms and reporting from Reuters and the Financial Times, at least 52 PLA naval vessels have been identified operating in 3 distinct zones around Taiwan. Zone 1 is north of Taiwan, near the Keelung port approaches. Zone 2 is southwest, near the Taiwan Strait's narrowest point. Zone 3, and this is the one that alarms analysts most, is southeast of Taiwan, near the Bashi Channel. Why does the Bashi Channel matter? Because it is the only deep-water exit between the Western Pacific and the South China Sea. If China controls the Bashi Channel, it can cut off Taiwan's access to the open ocean. It can prevent U.S. submarines from repositioning undetected. It can block the resupply corridors that Taiwan would desperately need if conflict turned kinetic. That is not a rehearsal position. That is a siege position. And here is the detail that is not making the front pages but absolutely should be. Chinese forces this time are not just circling Taiwan. For the first time since 1996, since the last major Taiwan Strait crisis, PLA warships have conducted what defense analysts are describing as simulated blockade runs. Live fire drills, not in open ocean, but in corridors within the 24 nautical mile contiguous zone of Taiwan's coast. This means Chinese ships and jets rehearsed in real time the exact operational steps they would take on day one of an actual invasion. Think about what that means. Now let us talk about how Washington responded. Because the response has been fast, pointed, and deliberately visible. Within hours of the PLA exercise announcement, the Pentagon confirmed the repositioning of the USS Ronald Reagan carrier strike group from its normal operating area in the Philippine Sea into the Western Pacific approaches east of Taiwan. 2 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, the USS Halsey and the USS Kidd, were confirmed operating within what the U.S. Pacific Fleet calls the First Island Chain Corridor. That is language that matters. The First Island Chain, running from Japan through Taiwan down to the Philippines, is the strategic boundary that American military planners treat as the front line of any Pacific conflict. Deploying carrier assets inside that line is not routine, it is a signal. But it did not stop there. The U.S. Indo-Pacific Command simultaneously announced what it called an enhanced freedom of navigation operation through the Taiwan Strait. A freedom of navigation operation is when U.S. military vessels physically sail through contested waters to assert that international law, not Beijing's preferences, governs those waters. The USS Ralph Johnson, an Arleigh Burke destroyer, transited the Taiwan Strait on Wednesday morning local time. China's Eastern Theater Command issued a formal warning calling the transit a deliberate provocation and stating that PLA forces were tracking and monitoring the American vessel throughout its passage. Translation: Chinese warships were shadowing an American warship, both armed at close range, in one of the most sensitive waterways on Earth. And then Japan entered the picture. Tokyo's Ministry of Defense confirmed that Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force vessels had joined a coordinated exercise with U.S. naval assets east of the Ryukyu Island chain. The Philippines called an emergency meeting of its National Security Council after confirming PLA vessels had briefly entered waters within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone near the Bataan Islands, which sit at the northern tip of the Philippines, directly adjacent to the Bashi Channel. So in the span of 72 hours, you have Chinese military forces conducting blockade simulations around Taiwan, American carrier groups repositioning to the first island chain, a freedom of navigation transit inside the strait, Japanese naval forces mobilizing in coordination, and the Philippines registering a formal territorial incursion. This is not one event. This is a cascade, and every step of that cascade has been choreographed by Beijing. Not randomly, not impulsively, deliberately. Here is why that matters. Joint Sword 2025A is not a reaction. The scale, the coordination, the positioning of 52 naval vessels into 3 synchronized zones, these require months of planning. The logistics alone demand weeks of pre-positioning. This exercise was coming regardless of whatever diplomatic statement or arms sale or political visit Beijing chose to use as a public justification. The justification is theater, the exercise is strategy. Now, before we go any further, if you are getting value from this breakdown, make sure you are subscribed to World Brief Daily and have your notifications turned on. We are covering this story in real time, and you do not want to miss the next update. So why is Beijing doing this right now? And why does the specific timing of this exercise tell us something critically important about what Xi Jinping is actually calculating? There are 3 forces converging simultaneously that Beijing has decided to test against each other. The first is Taiwan's defense posture. Over the past 18 months, Taiwan has accelerated a defense reform program that Taiwanese officials have called the most significant restructuring of its military in 40 years. The changes include extending conscription, increasing the defense budget to 2.5% of GDP, acquiring over 400 Harpoon anti-ship missiles, purchasing additional F-16V Block 70 fighters, and most significantly, deploying a new network of coastal defense systems based on domestically produced Yizhuang Feng-3 Sukhoi Ino anti-ship missiles. Taiwan is quietly but systematically transforming from a military build to project the image of defense into one actually capable of making an invasion catastrophically costly. Beijing is watching this. And Beijing does not like what it sees. The window in which Taiwan is militarily vulnerable before these defense upgrades are fully operational and integrated is closing. The question analysts are asking in closed-door sessions in Washington and Tokyo is whether Xi Jinping looks at that closing window and decides he must act before it shuts completely. Joint Sword 225A may be Beijing's way of testing how far Taiwan's upgraded defenses actually reach, where the radar coverage has gaps, how long Taiwanese command and control takes to respond, what U.S. reaction time looks like in practice versus in theory. The second force is the American distraction factor. Washington right now is managing simultaneous crises across multiple theaters. The situation with Iran in the Persian Gulf is consuming enormous naval resources, diplomatic bandwidth, and political attention. The situation in Ukraine continues to require sustained resource commitments. There are active negotiations across the Middle East and South Asia. Beijing is watching all of this too. Chinese strategic doctrine, specifically what PLA strategists call multi-directional pressure, holds that the optimal moment to advance on a priority objective is when your adversary is already stretched across multiple fronts. You do not need them to be losing elsewhere. You just need them to be occupied. Right now, the United States is occupied. And Beijing is testing whether an occupied America is still willing to respond to provocations in the Pacific with the same speed and commitment it would if every other theater were calm. The speed of Washington's carrier repositioning this week is part of the answer. But speed of repositioning and sustained operational commitment are 2 very different things. China is watching to see which one this actually is. The third force is the domestic pressure inside China. And this is the dimension that Western coverage consistently underweights, which may make it the most important of all. China's economy is under serious strain. The real estate sector, which at its peak accounted for roughly 25% of Chinese GDP, remains in structural crisis. Youth unemployment hit record levels before Beijing stopped publishing the data entirely. Consumer confidence is depressed. Foreign direct investment into China has dropped sharply. Trade tensions with Europe and the United States have not eased. Xi Jinping came to power on a promise that the Communist Party of China could deliver both prosperity and national greatness simultaneously. The prosperity part is under serious pressure. The national greatness part, the narrative of a rising China reasserting its rightful place in the world, has never been more important to domestic legitimacy. Military exercises around Taiwan are not just strategy, they are political theater for a domestic audience. They signal strength at a moment when the party badly needs to project it. The danger, historically, is what happens when domestic performance blends with genuine strategic calculation. When a leader cannot afford to back down because backing down looks weak at home, miscalculation becomes far more likely. Now let us walk through the 4 possible trajectories from here, because this is where the story gets truly consequential and where what happens in the next 72 hours will matter for decades. The first trajectory is controlled de-escalation. China completes the announced phase of Joint Sword 2025A, issues a triumphant statement about successfully demonstrating operational readiness, and withdraws the bulk of its forces back to standard positions. The U.S. keeps its carrier groups in the region for several weeks as a demonstration of commitment and then allows them to resume normal rotations. Quiet diplomatic backchannels, which absolutely do exist between Washington and Beijing, even at moments of high tension, work to establish a new informal understanding about what kinds of operations each side considers acceptable near the strait. This is the most likely outcome based on historical precedent. It is also the outcome that leaves every underlying structural dynamic completely unresolved. The window closes a little further. The next exercise comes a little sooner. The cycle tightens. The second trajectory is an incident at sea. 2 navies, both at heightened alert, both conducting aggressive operations in close proximity in waters where visibility is limited and communication protocols are imperfect. The risk of an unplanned collision, a miscommunication, a nervous weapons officer making the wrong call. These risks are not hypothetical. In 2001, a PLA Navy fighter collided with a U.S. surveillance aircraft over the South China Sea. The American crew survived, but the incident nearly derailed U.S.-China relations for a year and created a crisis that neither side had wanted or planned for. The difference between 2001 and today is that both sides are operating with far more assets, in far closer proximity, under far higher political tension. An incident at sea today would not play out the same way. The pressure to respond on both sides would be enormous. And responding would mean choosing between backing down, which neither government can afford politically, or escalating, which neither government should want rationally. This is the scenario that keeps military planners awake at night. Not a deliberate decision for war, an accident that forces a choice between humiliation and conflict. The third trajectory is economic warfare. Even if no shots are fired this week, China has a non-military option that could be equally destabilizing. Taiwan manufactures approximately 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors, the chips that power everything from smartphones to fighter jets to AI systems. TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, is not just an economic asset. It is a node of the entire global technological infrastructure. A sustained Chinese naval presence near Taiwan, even without actual conflict, creates insurance and supply chain uncertainty that global markets cannot tolerate indefinitely. Major chip customers, including American and European technology companies, would face existential pressure to diversify manufacturing away from Taiwan. That diversification takes years and costs hundreds of billions of dollars. But the pressure to begin it accelerates with every exercise, like Joint Sword 2025A. This means that even a successful Chinese de-escalation, in which no shots are fired, still advances Beijing's longer-term goal of creating doubt about Taiwan's reliability as the world's semiconductor core. Doubt is itself a weapon. The fourth trajectory is the one nobody wants to say out loud. If China's exercises reveal that Taiwan's early warning systems are slower than expected, that U.S. reinforcement timelines are longer than wargamed, and that regional allies are hesitant, there is a version in which Xi Jinping concludes that the window for successful military action is narrower than previously assessed, and that acting sooner rather than later is the rational choice. No one in Washington, Tokyo, Taipei, or Beijing wants this trajectory. But history is littered with conflicts that no one wanted and everyone sleepwalked into anyway. The mechanism is always the same. Signals get misread. Timelines compress. Decision-makers who meant to leave room for diplomacy discover that events have moved faster than their deliberations. That is why the next 72 hours are not abstract. They are the window in which the trajectory gets set. Before we reach the final assessment, there is one more dimension you need to understand, because this is not just about Taiwan. It is not even just about China and the United States. It is about what kind of world the next 50 years inhabits. Taiwan's role in the global semiconductor supply chain means that any military conflict in the Strait would trigger a technology shock, the likes of which the modern global economy has never experienced. Not a recession, a restructuring, the kind that takes a decade to recover from. Beyond semiconductors, a Chinese naval blockade of Taiwan, even a temporary one, would affect the shipping lanes that carry approximately 40% of global trade. The same lanes that carry goods from South Korea, Japan, Southeast Asia, and Australia to markets in Europe, North America, and the Middle East. The EU has been watching this week's developments with undisguised alarm. European Commission officials have privately told counterparts in Washington that a Taiwan contingency is now formally integrated into the EU's strategic risk models, something that was not true even 2 years ago. South Korea, which depends on both the U.S. security umbrella and trade with China, finds itself in an almost impossible position. Seoul's exports to China exceed its exports to the United States, and yet its entire security architecture is built around the American alliance. A conflict in the Taiwan Strait forces South Korea to choose, and choosing for Seoul means betting its economic future against its physical survival. Japan faces an even more direct dilemma. Under the revised terms of Japan's defense posture, the most significant departure from its post-war pacifist constitution in decades, Tokyo has now committed to possessing counterstrike capability, meaning Japanese missiles that can reach Chinese territory in a conflict scenario. That commitment was made with Taiwan specifically in mind. A Taiwan conflict is not a Taiwan conflict. It is a Pacific War. And a Pacific War, given the economic interdependencies involved, rapidly becomes a global economic catastrophe. This is what is actually at stake when a radar operator in Taipei sees that wall of blips at 4,047 in the morning. If you have made it this far, you understand exactly why this story matters beyond the headlines. Smash that subscribe button right now. Hit the notification bell, because this situation will develop in the next 48 hours, and we are going to be here with every update, every new development, every strategic layer that mainstream coverage is missing. And if this breakdown gave you clarity, share it. Send it to someone who should understand what is actually happening in the Pacific right now. Because an informed audience is the only audience that can demand informed leadership. Now let us end with the only question that actually matters. Not whether China will go to war, not whether the United States will respond, not even whether Taiwan can defend itself. The real question is this: does Xi Jinping genuinely believe, that the United States will fight? Because everything else, every exercise, every naval positioning, every diplomatic statement is a probe looking for the answer to that one question. And the brutal, honest, uncomfortable truth is this: the answer is not obvious. Not because the United States lacks the military capability. It has it overwhelmingly. Not because Washington lacks the commitment in principle. It has stated it repeatedly with unprecedented clarity. But because commitment stated is not the same as commitment tested. And what we are watching this week in the waters around Taiwan is the test. What happens in the next 72 hours will not just decide Taiwan's fate. It will define the credibility of every alliance, every security guarantee, and every promise the United States has made to every partner in every region for the next generation. That is what a wall of radar blips at 4,047 in the morning actually means. The clock is running, the world is watching. And the answer is not going to come from a press conference. It is going to come from the sea.